die. Many more would be left helpless.
This disease was terrifying. We didn't know how it was transmitted.
This is polio.
We knew there was a virus, but we didn't know how we got it. We didn't know how our kids got it, and we were terrified about it.
It was frightening because it affected children, and it affected them in a particularly poignant way.
The disease was poliomyelitis.
I had classmates that were like that.
Polio would enlist renowned scientists, shape the vision of one of the world's greatest leaders, and transform a young unknown doctor into a world-famous hero. Ingenuity, trial and error, even acts of scientific desperation would pave the way for one of the greatest breakthroughs in scientific history. Tonight on Modern Marvels, the search for the polio vaccine. As America entered the 1950s, a disease unheard of just 50 years earlier.
That's an iron lump, and you can see what it's done to that kid. And it'd be like if you were in a propane tank with just your head sticking out. So you're going to see a lot of images of an iron lung. Some of you probably never seen a picture of one even.
Earlier, had grown into an annual event of...
Look at the terror on those parents' faces. And so when it hit, sometimes you couldn't move any muscles at all.
terror and apprehension. Polio targeted anyone at any age, but mostly it targeted young, healthy children, making it seem more destructive and cruel than other diseases. Polio, also called infantile paralysis, was a mystery.
Did they get it from the water? Did they get it from insects? Did they get it from animals? We were petrified, and many parents, many of us kept our kids home. We were frightened. We were frightened.
The lives of millions of children were changed by the fear polio caused.
It was really frightening for parents during the polio years. There were terms such as polio weather. Don't send the children to the beach. They can't go to the community pool. No one knew where polio came from. They didn't know how to protect their children.
One day, scientists would learn that polio was a fecal-oral disease. Children or adults coming in close contact could infect each other through water or food contaminated by feces. But for the first half of the century, only the fearsome symptoms were understood. It began with a sniffle, then a fever, then suddenly the cries of a child screaming in fear, unable to move, sometimes unable to get a breath of air. Polio patients spent weeks in the hospital trying to battle the odds and recover. The diagnosis of polio was just the beginning of a long, painful journey.
One of the fears, I think, was that polio could not only obviously severely threaten the life of a child, but that even if the child survived, there would be some
That's her there.
significant polio handicap, which would be the result of that virus.
The virus itself lasted anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, but the damage to the spine could shut down healthy muscles in arms, legs, even lungs. Therapy began immediately after the fever subsided. Rehabilitation was long, tedious, and painful.
One of the things that's not in a lot of the literature also is that polio has a lot of pain associated with it on a daily basis. Not a severe pain, but constant pain. And the pain is associated not so much with the handicap, but with the wearing of a brace.
With the help of a brace, the fortunate might walk again. The less fortunate were placed in iron lungs to help them breathe, forever trapped in the humming metal tubes. polio survivors could look forward to a life in a world ill-equipped for their special needs, a life of dependency and continual care.
And my own family, they were kind of locked in to taking care of me. I was like the dishes. No, I felt as though I was treated like the dishes. It's your turn to give her exercises today. I gave her exercises yesterday. You know, let's switch. I'll do it today if you do it for me tomorrow, that kind of thing.
Families were ill-equipped as well, and so were important public institutions.
In my school, there were
Most of these survivors that you'll see being interviewed, they would have to be in their 80s or 90s now. So this was filmed obviously quite a few years ago on these interviews.
many times when I was just forgotten, and I'll never forget the time I was left in the classroom. The teacher hadn't made any arrangement for me, and I sat in the room, this little child just crying silently because I didn't want to bother anybody. And I was just going to sit there, but no provision had been made for me.
Often, polio meant a series of long, painful surgeries to free paralyzed limbs.
Most polio patients have gone through several operations. And the thing with the operations was that they rehabilitated you to your optimum at one point. Then they did the operation and you lost all that ground and you had to restart all over again. And that was hard. That was really hard.
Even the Egyptians battled the dreaded disease polio.
See the atrophied leg? It's been around a while.
But an epidemic striking thousands was a phenomenon of the 20th century. It was in 1916 that the horror had begun. America, preparing for World War I, had little idea that a devastating and destructive virus was about to attack at home. It was in the muggy heat of Manhattan in June that the first cases were reported. By July, a few cases had grown to 100. By September, over 1,000 new cases had appeared. Health officials and doctors were baffled. Why polio? Why now? Polio wasn't always fatal, but 2,000 were paralyzed and over 2,000 had died. Astounding numbers for a disease that was considered rare. From the beginning, the questions mounted faster than the answers. The little that was known wasn't very encouraging.
The major challenge in medicine and in trying to prevent disease and control disease is to find the causes of the disease and how it evolves. So we did not know what caused poliomyelitis, so we could not prevent the disease.
Even if the cause...
Okay, anybody recognize this dude here? Anybody? This is not the actor, this is the real thing. Yeah, it's Pasteur.
Cause of polio wasn't known, early medical pioneers had worked to discover the secrets of other deadly viruses. In 1796, Edward Jenner experimented with a killer virus and gave the world its first vaccine.
Smallpox was considered a major scourge, had destroyed civilizations. So Edward Jenner observed that milkmaids that used to milk the cows would not get smallpox. That observation led him to believe that individuals infected with cowpox would become immune against smallpox. So Jenner used the cowpox to protect individuals against smallpox.
The Latin word for cow is vacca, so Jenner called his method a vaccination. Louis Pasteur, almost 100 years later, would provide the next vital link in understanding immunization. Working with...
Okay, what's he have in his left hand? Right.
Rabies, Pasteur believed, like Jenner, that the disease itself could be used to fight the infection it caused. But rather than inject the blood directly, this time Pasteur would dilute or attenuate the rabies virus. He reasoned correctly that a weakened virus
You can see there that he was worked in his old age. That's another thing I liked about it, okay?
would still cause the body to fight the infection without causing the illness. Pasteur diluted rabies in the spinal cord tissue of animals, then ground the tissue and injected
Now, that's the older Pasteur. That's actually Joseph Meister there.
it into humans. It was
Notice he's injected in the abdomen. Well, his assistant is anyway.
a risky, sometimes deadly procedure. Sometimes it worked, but it was very controversial.
Pasteur, like many creative scientists, went against many of the traditions of the day, and so he endured criticism, as many creative scientists and people in other fields would.
In the 19th century, scientists worked to solve the polio puzzle, but progress was slow.
Many times those diseases were supposed to be coming from fumes from the environment, and from the positions of the stars and so on and so forth.
Still effects of the Dark Ages.
One of the major challenges in the prevention of a disease is to find out what provokes that disease.
In 1908, scientist Karl Landensteiner proved what many scientists had suspected. Polio was caused by a virus.
So it was the first breakthrough. Okay, now we can see if through manipulation of this virus in a way or another, eventually we can have a vaccine.
But knowing that a virus caused polio was one thing. Finding a way to vaccinate against it was another. By the early 1920s, outbreaks of polio were becoming more frequent. Polio dominated the headlines during summer months. And America was about to learn that even the mighty weren't immune.
Search for the polio vaccine.
As America danced its way into the 1920s, the nation's optimism and sense of
Oh, do y'all know that dance by any means? You don't know this dance?
youthful fun was tempered by a creeping illness that could strike at any moment. Polio was taking more lives and crippling more children every year. Although it preferred children, adults were not immune. Franklin Roosevelt was a young and ambitious star in New York politics. Cousin Teddy had paved the way, and Franklin, patrician, wealthy, was poised to carry on the Roosevelt legacy. But polio would create a detour in his political life, a fortunate accident for the fight against the disease. In 1920, Franklin had just finished a grueling campaign for vice president. He lost, but was considered a contender for the presidency. At 38, he was poised for greatness. All he had to do was step up to accept the mantle. Tired by his vice presidential campaign, Roosevelt retired to Campobello, his family retreat. On the first day, he swam and went fishing with his children. On the second day, he felt a little feverish. On the morning of the third day, he fell to the floor, unable to get up. Fortunately, a doctor was vacationing nearby, but the diagnosis was devastating. It was polio. Roosevelt easily could have retired into a life of luxury. Instead, he chose to fight the disease.
Roosevelt was desperately trying to regain the ability to walk. And in 1924, he went down to Warm Springs, Georgia, because he heard that there were warm waters and a pool at the spa there. He thought that swimming in the warm water and moving in the warm water would relieve his muscles, and he could develop them and learn to walk.
The warm water soothed his weary muscles, and he found comfort in the company of others who shared his affliction. So enamored was Roosevelt with Warm Springs that in 1927 he decided to buy it. But a polio resort would never draw healthy patrons to waters used by polio patients.
Okay, you're going to see a very rare shot there of his atrophied legs. And you're going to find a little bit later that the general population didn't even know he had polio, that he was paralyzed. So the media normally just didn't photograph him where that was obvious. But you can see how atrophied his legs are.
Warm Springs was a therapeutic success, but as a resort, it was a financial disaster. The next few years, Roosevelt worked in his law office part-time, but spent most of his time searching for a cure, working futilely to recover the strength of his paralyzed.
Yeah, that wasn't a regular wheelchair. The story of that was just a kitchen chair that they put wheels on. He didn't want a just traditional wheelchair.
Limbs. Roosevelt's convalescence was long, but his return to public life was triumphant.
A familiar figure, now on crutches, slowly mounted the rostrum. He was clearly an heroic figure to the delegates.
Easily elected governor of New York, he had emerged from his trial with conviction and strength, prepared to lead a country headed for its own dark trials of confidence. Had Warm Springs been even a modest success, the story of polio might have been different. But by 1928, Roosevelt had spent almost $200,000, nearly 2/3 of his family fortune, trying to keep the resort afloat.
That doesn't sound like much then. That was a lot of money then.
The unlikely man who would find the solution was Roosevelt's friend and law partner, Basil O'Connor. The son of Irish immigrants, O'Connor had worked his way up from the ghettos of New York. He was a no-nonsense leader, gruff but compassionate.
Basil O'Connor was a bulldog once he got onto an idea. He was tough. He was soft-hearted too. He didn't like to fire people. He remembered that his father had once been fired and saw his father come home crying. So he had a lot of compassion, but he was also a hard-boiled kind of guy.
As Roosevelt built his political base, it was O'Connor he turned to get things done. He liked O'Connor and trusted him. O'Connor was the logical person to turn to when Warm Springs was on the brink of financial ruin.
Basil O'Connor reluctantly went down to Warm Springs with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt said, come on, and he wasn't too enthusiastic about the whole idea, didn't give a darn about polio or polio victims, but he agreed to do it and gradually got more interested, and eventually he gave up his law practice and made it a crusade.
As O'Connor thought about what might be done with Warm Springs, Roosevelt's political skills were propelling him forward. By 1932, Roosevelt had reached the highest office in the land. Gripped by the Great Depression, America had a president that had experience with hardship. Roosevelt understood fear and uncertainty, and he understood the power of the presidency.
Roosevelt was quick to get on the radio in what he called fireside chats and reassure the country. There was his famous phrase that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. He sold the country on that. Conditions didn't improve terribly much.
Yeah, in your grandparents' and great-grandparents' time, people literally would gather around a radio and listen to programs. Yeah, they really did.
Until World War II, and with huge government spending on war production and so on, that really ended the Depression, but Roosevelt ended it in people's minds.
Roosevelt's manipulation of the media would help him wage a great battle against the disease he felt compelled to hide.
Mainly, it was just a general gentleman's agreement among the media and so on that you didn't photograph the president in this way. So the country as a whole did not realize that he was crippled.
Newspapers, radio, and film were helping America shape its opinions, and Roosevelt was about to use his political clout to launch a great crusade against polio. Roosevelt and O'Connor had an idea. Warm Springs could be saved by turning it called the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. The foundation would provide money to help the afflicted and fund the search for a vaccine. To raise money, Roosevelt sponsored a presidential ball and invited political appointees from around the country to attend.
The birthday balls were a big success all over the country. They started to raise about $1 million a year, and they didn't quite know what to do with all that money, so they began to establish local chapters all over the country.
But the foundation's coffers would stay filled only so long as Roosevelt was president. A longer-term solution to the fundraising dilemma was needed.
Okay, you saw him doing something there that you probably had no idea what he was doing. But like in your grandparents' time, we had fountain pens that used actual ink. And it had a bladder in it and a little lever. You'd had to put it down in the ink and suck ink up. It took a long time to dry. So he just signed something. And then you'd have to put a blotter to blot up the excess ink. So ask your grandparents about it.
Advertising jingles were beginning to help sell toothpaste. Roosevelt and O'Connor had an idea. Maybe they could find a way to convince America to fund the drive for a polio cure. Hollywood was anxious to help. All that was needed was a slogan.
So in 1937, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis was formed, and they had a meeting. And
Okay, that was a childhood actor, Eddie Cantor. And now we're going to fast forward to the present, and he's going to come up with a term that we still have today. Now, it's not used for polio now. I think its main object is birth defects, but Eddie Cantor, let's know carefully what he did.
Eddie Cantor was there, and he said,
There he is later.
why not have people send dimes to the White House? And maybe we can call it the March of Dimes.
So that's where the term March of Dimes came from.
Oh, I know, that's a march.
Okay, now, the veterans don't speak up. The rest of you've probably seen movies that these in that were made like in the middle to late 30s, particularly one on the left. Notice the little short guy on the right. See if you recognize her voice. She played in a famous movie.
Dimes, the infantile paralysis fund. That's right.
What'd she play in? Right.
Right, and Judy, when I spend a dime on myself for some little luxury like this, I always think about those unfortunate kids and how far just a dime will go toward helping.
At first, Roosevelt and O'Connor thought their campaign had failed. Only a few dimes trickled in. But soon, the trickle became a torrent. So overwhelmed was the mailroom at the White House that important correspondence couldn't get through. The money poured in quick.
Okay, ask your grandparents about this. So if they were born like in the early 40s or so, in grade school, every classroom, they would give each student a little card with little slots, and you could put dimes in it. And man, that was a feather in a class if everybody in the class got their card full of dimes. And so I could remember going up and down the roads, and back then people littered too, and they'd get soft drinks, they just throw their bottle out. And you could get 2 cents for turning those bottles in. When you bought a soft drink, you had to put up a deposit if you carried it with you and you took it back, and you'd get your 2 cents. So that's how I fill my card up with dimes, is finding bottles on the side of the road. And so ask your grandparents about it. They probably did something similar.
Quickly, but a scientific tragedy not linked to the foundation showed the need to proceed slowly.
A couple of scientists developed an inactivated virus polio vaccine and tried it, and it caused some death.
You remember what we covered that today? What's another word for inactivated? Again. Oh, I'm sorry, I was talking over you. What?
Eradicated.
I hadn't heard the right word yet. Inactivated was the same as killed. Live was the same as attenuated or weakened. And you're going to see the history. The first one's going to be an inactivated. The second one was an attenuated.
Yes, the vaccine. There was a weakened polio virus. It wasn't weakened enough. But this made O'Connor and others see the need for a major research program that would hopefully lead to a successful vaccine.
2 children had died and 3 had become paralyzed. O'Connor acted.
Now, that's from a vaccine that was attenuated but wasn't weakened enough. Nowadays, there have been lawsuits, and what would have happened to the research project to get a vaccine? You'd probably come to a screeching halt.
Quickly, establishing a vaccination committee. Scientists would be screened and chosen carefully before receiving the endorsement of the foundation. Information would be shared amongst the scientists. Watching anxiously was a young, virtually unknown doctor named Jonas Salk.
Well, that was him on the left, but you'll see more shots of him.
He was about to embark on a journey that would change the
That's him, Jonas Salk. He's kind of one of my generation's heroes. I was in the 8th grade when his vaccine came out.
course of scientific history. As the 1940s came to a close, America had weathered the devastating trial of World War II.
That was a real kamikaze there. Flew the plane into a ship.
The enemy overseas had been vanquished, but the enemy at home, polio, was still just as destructive as ever. Almost 300,000 cases had been reported since 1916. Of those, almost 50,000 had died. Desperate measures were taken to prevent polio's spread.
Literally tons of DDT are used on this dread disease that attacks us.
DDT, that caused so many problems, it was banned. And you figure out why they're spraying DDT to get rid of polio. DDT didn't kill polio virus. Why were they spraying DDT?
Isn't that an insecticide?
Yeah, polio is caused by a virus, but why are they spraying DDT? How was it transmitted? Do you remember that from earlier? It was a what kind of disease? Transmission. Fecal oral. And you're so young, it'd probably have to be your great-grandparents. If you're older, you might notice this, but so much of the country was still rural. They had outhouses or just out. So if someone had polio, what could spread it from person to person? Think. Well, if human feces is just left out exposed, it attracts what? Flies. Flies then could land on your milk glass or walk on the food and spread the polio virus. That's why they were spraying DDT. And, or if you remember your great-grandparents, if there was a fly visiting the table and getting on the food, they probably had a different response to it than you do. Anybody have that experience to notice that things came to a screeching halt till that fly was killed? You just shooed away in full speed ahead. But there was a generation that so feared polio that, man, flies, I mean, they were hated with a vengeance. So that's why they were spraying the DDT.
Our young.
Parents wanted freedom from the fear that their babies could suddenly be stricken, but progress on a vaccine was slow. Scientist Albert Sabin had been working to find the solution since the mid-30s. Like Jenner and Pasteur, Sabin believed that weakening the live virus was the key. Sabin would one day help eradicate polio, but his early work led to the mistaken belief that poliovirus grew only in spinal tissue. It meant that large quantities of the virus could never be harvested, since spinal tissue was unstable. This was the greatest barrier to a vaccine. But within a few years, one man, Jonas Salk, would hatch a brilliant plan, one based on solid science, but born of inspiration and hard work. The son of Russian Jewish immigrants, Salk had graduated top in his class at college. With a loan and $1,000 that his parents had scraped together, he entered medical school at NYU. Ambitious and talented, Salk could look forward to a promising and lucrative career as a physician. Young doctors in training witnessed firsthand the suffering of polio patients. But Salk could also hear the hopeful prediction that a new field, virology, might soon solve the polio puzzle. Inspired, Salk opted to enter the research field. When a professor asked him why he'd turned down a lucrative career, Salk replied, "There's more to life than money."
Did you catch that? Even his professors, you're like, why are you giving up, lucrative practice to go into research? So there's still dedicated people in the science field in medicine. Well, maybe a few, but he said there's more to life than money. So thanks to that, your grandparents probably didn't die of polio, or your parents, or you.
Upon graduation, he began looking for a research home to start his exploration. He found it at the University of Michigan with Thomas Francis.
Oh, what's the Michigan connection, folks? What's the Michigan connection? We covered it today. Right, so they knew more about virology than most of the other schools. So here's the guy, he very well could have studied at the Pasteur Institute or the Institute for Infectious Disease that was named or built in honor of Robert Koch. So he's at Michigan now.
Who was experimenting with the flu virus.
So this guy was working with the flu virus. So he was working in virology during this time period.
Francis was experimenting with a new approach for vaccines. Instead of weakening the virus, as Pasteur and Sabin had done, he killed the inside of the virus, the part that allowed it to replicate. The outer shell could still fool the body into believing it was infected and thus fight the disease. Francis' work was made possible in part because by 1935, the electron microscope provided the first look at a virus.
A virus is basically a package of genetic information. You could compare it to an audio tape or a videotape that carries information.
Now, fast forward that to a CD or a DVD. Same principle. Listen carefully here, and it's a good analogy.
For making sound or making pictures, but without a machine to play it, the tape itself is inert.
Healthy cells in the human body are the machine that play the polio tape. The proteins on the outer shell of the virus bind to healthy cells. The inside of the virus, the RNA or DNA.
Now, that's not accurate. When we cover it, I'll show you what it really takes place. So producers aren't always up on their microbiology. So it doesn't squirt it in there like that. So just kind of forget you saw that.
DNA allows the virus to mutate or grow inside the healthy cell, taking over the healthy cell. The human body provides natural protection called antibodies, whose purpose is to attack the virus and virus-infected cells and kill them. But sometimes the virus is too strong and the immune system is overwhelmed. As Salk quietly worked in the lab, Basil O'Connor was busy building the foundation into a powerful organization.
As a fashion show sparks the polio drive at the Waldorf, the models lead the parade of dime donors, and that iron lung really rings with the silver shower, which will go far to help infantile paralysis sufferers.
The war years had been tough, but donations continued to pour in, and the public wanted to know how their money was being spent. Unfortunately, O'Connor and the foundation had little to report. In 1946, the discovery that poor children were less likely to contract polio explained polio's sudden destructiveness in the 20th century.
Okay, here's the explanation for it. And you may be aware that if you protect your babies too much, and my daughter did this and I warned her, and then she paid for it. I mean, we had to wash our hands, before we could pick him up. And she basically almost kept him in a bubble. And then after he got a little older, man, he caught everything that came along. So listen carefully and you'll find why polio hit when it did.
When you clean up a country and have modern sanitation, then the infants and children don't develop immunity, and bango, at some point the virus strikes.
By 1947, Salk was anxious for his own lab.
That was the year I started the first grade.
He decided on the University of Pittsburgh, choosing a place where he could explore his own scientific passions.
Do you figure they knew much about viruses at the University of Pittsburgh? No, they probably didn't know how to spell it, but there's a reason that he went there.
Salk went to the University of Pittsburgh because he said there was nothing there in the way of virology. He said going to Pittsburgh was like going west to the frontier days. Pittsburgh was the frontier. And he established his own virus laboratory where he could be in charge.
At Pittsburgh, Salk lost no time getting to work. Once he had put together his lab, virtually from scratch, he set about the difficult task of raising money for his new project. It was the foundation to which he turned.
It was known that there was a polio virus, but nobody knew how many types there were or what they did. And the National Foundation commissioned Salk to work on typing the virus.
It's important to identify the different strains of the virus because the immune response of the body can be different against different strains.
In the late 40s, scientists working at Harvard changed.
Oh, working where? Harvard. Remember that connection? So listen carefully. You're going to think of some advances, and it was probably because the people there had been going and studying, you know where, is why they were so advanced. So be sure you get the connection of Harvard and the big breakthrough.
Changed the face of polio research. The highly respected virologist, John Enders, brought down the one great barrier to a vaccine. Enders and his team were cultivating mumps virus in tissue cultures. They decided to add a strain of polio to some leftover cultures. The results were astonishing. Not only did the virus grow, it thrived. In one experiment, it was...
Okay, they tried to grow the polio virus in lots of different things, and it was thought that it would only grow in living central nervous system tissue. And I don't think they'd tell you what kind of culture it was. We'll cover it later. But Enders was working with the mumps, and he was growing it in monkey kidney tissue. So it's monkey kidney tissue that they put some polio viruses in, and it surprised them. It grew. And that was the big breakthrough.
Proven that polio could in fact be grown in non-nervous cell tissue.
This was the plow that broke the plains. When Salk heard of Enders' 1949 work, he immediately saw that a vaccine would be possible, and he got ready to work on one.
The question asked was which was better, a weakened vaccine, as Sabin favored, or a killed vaccine, as Salk advocated. Salk would need to convince O'Connor and the Foundation to support him, and in 1951, he got his chance. An invitation to address other working scientists at a conference in Copenhagen. But it was the trip home that proved almost as valuable as the conference. Salk returned to America aboard the Queen Mary. Also aboard were Basil O'Connor and his wife.
Remember, that's the guy that worked with Roosevelt and helped him organize and oversee the March of Dimes and all the research. And they just happened to get together on that return trip.
O'Connor invited them to sit at his table. And Salk was somewhat entranced by this smooth, sophisticated guy, O'Connor. And O'Connor was taken with this young, enthusiastic, serious kid who believed that a vaccine was possible. It was the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
But what Salk was proposing was not free from risk. O'Connor still remembered 1935, the last time a killed virus had been used with devastating results. Salk relied on formalin to kill the inner core of the virus. It was the exact same method that had been used during the ill-fated experiment in 1935.
Now, formalin is basically a compound like formaldehyde that you preserve animals and you embalm people with. And the formalin destroyed the DNA. That's how you inactivate it, or quotation mark, killed it.
This time, however, Salk believed he knew how to kill the virus completely. Despite the risk, O'Connor trusted Salk. The two men, as different as they seemed, had much in common. Both were sons of immigrants, self-made, hard-working, determined. And they shared a common passion to rid the world of polio. While O'Connor was interested in Salk and his work, there were other scientists competing for the foundation's funds. The enormous expense of testing a vaccine meant the foundation would have to be careful about backing one scientist or approach prematurely. A recent scandal had proven the point. Noted scientist Hillary Koprowski shocked the scientific community in 1951, announcing that he had, on his own, injected live virus into volunteers. Doubly shocking was the revelation that the volunteers had been patients at a New York mental institution. No one was infected, but the foundation was outraged. Salk was certain his killed vaccine was the key, but important work remained in the lab to prove the vaccine was ready for the public. Salk focused on the strongest, most virulent strain of polio, the Mahoney strain.
Now, that's not the virus, that's a nerve cell that it would have been replicating in.
He reasoned that since the virus was dead, strength wouldn't matter. Besides, the stronger strain grew well in the laboratory. The antibody response would be the same in weaker strains. Salk was making excellent progress, and it was a good thing.
Now, the guy on the left is a famous newsman from the era, Edward R. Murrow. And so the press was keeping up with what was going on.
Because in 1952, the U.S. was experiencing its worst epidemic yet. 56,000 cases of poliomyelitis, one severe case for every 3,000 people. The public cried desperately for a solution. Jonas Salk believed that he could provide it.
The search for the polio.
By the 1950s, polio's grip over America was the strongest it had ever been. Polio had become a summer ritual of fear. But Jonas Salk was about to change that. For 5 years, Salk had been working feverishly in the lab, conducting tests to prove that his vaccine could work. For those beyond a cure, the March of Dimes did what could be done to ease the pain. Polio was an expensive disease.
You see a kind of similar line of iron lungs. Still several years ago said that there's a museum somewhere in Tyler that has one of these iron lungs that were so commonly in use back then. But I don't know where. Do any of you happen to know about a museum in Tyler that could have that? Anybody? Is this the first time some of you have ever seen pictures of an iron lung? And the way it worked, there was a collar around your neck, and it would put pressure on your body, kind of like with the bellows, put pressure and it put pressure on your chest cavity, you release it, and to draw the air in. That's why they were called iron lungs. Nowadays, they just put something down your throat, like the ventilators with the COVID patients, but that's what they used to have to put people in.
And many turned to the March of Dimes for help.
Back in the 50s, my shoes cost between $75 and $100. My mother didn't have to purchase the brace for me because she petitioned the March of Dimes, and the March of Dimes provided the money for the brace. But she had to pay for the shoes.
Rehabilitation required money and patience.
The children and I were told how to walk. And it was the right arm, left foot, left arm, right foot. And you know, you had to have this rhythm going when you walked. You couldn't just walk any kind of way.
With each epidemic, the number of polio patients requiring expensive medical treatment increased. It seemed that there was no end in sight to the tragedy. After 5 long years working in the lab, Salk was ready for the next momentous step, trying the vaccine on a human being.
And guess who the first one to get the vaccine was? Yeah. Now, if you were his wife, would you have gone along with this next part?
In a bold move, he injected not only himself, but his entire family with his killed polio virus.
I think he was confident about the safety of the vaccine, and he was willing to inoculate himself and his children as an indication of his confidence in the safety of it.
The injections worked. Salk and his family showed evidence of antibodies that could fight polio. But it was far from the proof needed to convince the scientific community. For that, a large trial was necessary. First, Salk decided to conduct a top-secret test on a small number of polio patients at the Watson Home for Crippled Children. Despite his confidence in the vaccine, Salk had to take every precaution possible.
Dr. Salk felt that it would be more acceptable to have a vaccine used in people who had already been exposed to the virus than it would be to use that vaccine in people who had not been exposed.
When the results were in, antibodies had increased. The experiment had worked. But would the vaccine work on healthy children? Would it provide...
Can you figure out what those kids are carrying home? Anybody have any idea? So if you had kids and they bring one of these home, would you sign it? I figure you figured out what they're carrying home.
significant protection? Could healthy kids become infected? These were all possibilities. Some scientists didn't think the larger trial should proceed.
There's a lot of debate about when vaccines would be tried and who would take them. There's a consideration of cost and who should pay for the vaccine, who should be given the vaccine, how broadly it should be used, and so on.
But Salk, with O'Connor's support, called for an immediate trial. There was no time to waste.
Any vaccine that is available should be used. And whatever vaccine is available should be used now and should be used before the coming summer.
For a large trial, hundreds of thousands of people would need to be convinced to participate. Parents would be volunteering their children. Salk found himself playing a new role now, public spokesperson for his vaccine. And the press loved him. Jonas Salk was direct, sincere, and intelligent. He inspired confidence and trust. The perfect hero to soothe an anxious, expectant public. But Salk embraced his growing fame with great reluctance. Some scientists were outraged at the increased attention paid to Salk. His willingness to mention the contribution of others did little to mollify the scientific community.
What's that called? The green-eyed monster. Jealousy.
Salk later said that Enders threw a forward pass and I caught it. And other scientists never forgave Salk for taking that much credit.
Despite the heavy and growing responsibilities in public, Salk worked privately in the lab to ensure all details were in place. The last, most important hurdle was to ensure mass production of his vaccine was done properly. Big commercial labs would manufacture large quantities of the vaccine in assembly line fashion. But the slightest mistake could be devastating. A bad vaccine going out would be disastrous. Production had to be perfect. Basil O'Connor was also taking steps to ensure the trial came off perfectly. There could be no questions about methodology or results. The foundation would provide the logistical support and coordinate personnel. Through the early spring of '53, the foundation struggled with numerous decisions. Over 500,000 people would be participating. Boxes of supplies and vial after vial of vaccine would have to be distributed. Then there was the calculating the results. Thomas Francis, Salk's friend and mentor from Ann Arbor, was asked to oversee the trial. It was a fitting reunion with the man who had helped inspire the Salk vaccine. By early 1954, 2 years after Salk had injected himself with the vaccine was ready to be given to the public. Salk and O'Connor were convinced the vaccinations would proceed safely, but Sabin still doubted the wisdom of the trial.
There had never been a trial of the size of the 1954 field trial of the Salk vaccine. And before that trial by the Public Health Service, many bitterly opposed it, among them Enders, Sabin. They thought it was dangerous. They thought, A, it wouldn't work, and B, it was dangerous. Enders told Salk that he was unethical.
Salk and the foundation believed they had to try. On April 26, 1954, the trials began. Children were inoculated by thousands of volunteer nurses and doctors. They were called polio pioneers and told by teachers that pioneers are special people who go first. Chalkboards across America were filled with the same message. Over 200,000 vials of the vaccine would be needed, over 1 million needles, as many cotton swabs, not to mention the public space required for such an undertaking. First, blood was taken from each child, then the inoculation given. 2 weeks later, another blood sample was taken to compare the difference in antibody levels. All the samples had to be checked carefully. With over 500,000 participants, the logistics were enormous. At first, everything went well. Then the unimaginable happened. A child inoculated by the Salk vaccine had come down with polio.
Oh, what would happen today if that happened during a vaccine trial? There'd be lawsuits, and that would probably be the end of it. So why were the parents willing to continue? You probably can't comprehend that. Now, this would have been the fear that your great-grandparents had for your grandparents, because they had seen people die from it, be paralyzed from it. My late wife had an aunt that died of polio. And I can mention, I had classmates in grade school all the way to junior college that had polio. It was a great fear.
It was a tragedy that could end the trials. Even worse, the media got hold of the news, releasing it to a startled, worried public. Salk was crushed. O'Connor told friends later, Salk was heartbroken. It was his vaccine, and he knew there wasn't a damn thing wrong with it when it was made properly. Fortunately, the disaster was soon explained. One of the labs had failed to kill the virus completely. Salk reassured the public that it would never happen again.
Our contention and the thing that we discussed today has been that it should be possible to prevent paralytic poliomyelitis by the proper use of a properly constituted vaccine.
Despite their fears, most parents were desperate for a cure, and they agreed to continue the trial. Most believed that the benefits outweighed the risk.
In the scientific community, and particularly in medicine, people like to move slowly. You know, there's a saying, first do no harm. That isn't really possible. You can't do anything without doing some harm.
By March of 1955, all the lab work had been completed, and the result...
Oh, that's a computer, by the way. It was a punch card computer. I mean, they were still in operation up into the early 70s.
...was tabulated. An anxious and expectant nation waited for the results. A conference was called on April 12, 1955, coincidentally the 10th anniversary of Franklin Roosevelt's death.
I was a reporter on the Minneapolis Tribune in 1955. We had had several bad polio epidemics. We were frantic for this news, and the PR people and the guards brought the stacks of press releases into the press room, and we all surged forward to get them, you know, like a bunch of shoppers at Macy's during a sale, every man for himself.
Soon the word was out. The Salk vaccine worked. A nation gripped by fear summer after summer was able to breathe a heavy, happy sigh of relief as Salk shared the news. Asked by the media who owned the patent to the vaccine, Salk replied, "The people do. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?"
Did Pasteur get rich over his anthrax vaccine? No. Salk didn't get rich over this. He didn't have a patent for it. Nowadays, man, he'd have had a patent. He was still working, doing his research when he died. He was working on an AIDS vaccine when he died.
Salk's vaccine proved that polio could be beaten, but the task to end the scourge in America was far from accomplished. As news of the Salk vaccine was reaching a hungry, anxious public, Albert Sabin was working on his own vaccine.
That's the two of them there. So they were kind of friendly rivals. And they died, I think, the same year, but I've lost track, probably 7 or 8 years ago, but they died the same year.
Sabin remained convinced that a live virus approach was better than the Salk vaccine. His work was about to profoundly influence the challenge to eradicate polio from the world. By 1957, millions of children had been vaccinated with Salk's vaccine for polio. It was clear that although Salk's vaccine dealt polio a lethal blow, it couldn't finish the job. His vaccine required multiple shots to maintain its effectiveness.
It took 3 shots on his.
Unbelievably, some had to be convinced to take the follow-up shots that were required. Albert Sabin believed he had found a solution to the problem. He had successfully weakened the virus, and he was convinced his live virus method was better than Salk's. It could be taken orally and was therefore much more convenient. Although it required refrigeration, it was much easier to administer on a mass basis.
So everybody that had taken Salk's vaccine, when Sabin's vaccine came out, we also took that one, because if you saw from that graph, Salk's was like 70 to 80% effective. And so there were still people coming down with polio, even with the massive vaccination, but the cases were dramatically dropped. And you're going to see then about the history of the one that's called the oral vaccine. And so most of you received the oral vaccine, unless you were born after January of 2000. So we'll cover that later about the January of 2000.
No matter where people lived, they could easily take the vaccine.
Well, I meant to stop it, but you saw that picture of a little kid with a sugar cube in his mouth. When we took it, they put the vaccine, the oral vaccine, on a sugar cube. Then you let it slowly dissolve under your tongue. This is the way, if you were born prior to 2000, they actually took a dropper and put it under your tongue, and you absorbed it that way. It didn't have to be kept refrigerated like the other one. Anybody could give it, and it was one time, and it was close to 100% effective.
Vaccine. Those giving the Sabin vaccine needed no special medical training. Best of all, children were grateful to be spared the nasty needle. In the late 1950s, in an unusual example of détente, the Sabin vaccine was sent to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and given to hundreds of thousands of children. Ostensibly used to test the effectiveness of Sabin's vaccine, the Eastern European trials were so successful that the Sabin approach became the vaccine of choice the world over. In fact, it was Sabin's vaccine that would ultimately eradicate polio in the Western Hemisphere, although it would take decades to do so. The last reported case was in Peru as recently as 1992. Today, polio continues to cripple children in developing nations. But with the help of Rotary International, the Pan American Health Organization plans to eradicate polio from the world by the year 2000.
It's important to consider also that the work of Sabin and Salk is not yet finished. They gave us the tools, but we are not using yet to its full power. And I believe that if there is collaboration between all countries, if there is support from the industrialized world to the developing countries, we can have a 21st century free of poliomyelitis.
Despite the tremendous success of those who work to battle the disease, the fight continues to this day. Those stricken with polio as children find that as adults, the disease often returns to cripple again.
I want people to know that when polio comes back You go into a deep depression. You go into denial. The best thing to do in my life is not to use up too much energy. Find ways to conserve energy, because if I get tired, my tiredness changes into pain.
Scientists are still trying to discover why those who suffered as children suffer again in later years as adults. Jonas Salk had helped eradicate a cruel disease. He was still a young man with many years of work and research ahead of him. With the help of the March of Dimes and the city of San Diego, Salk established a research institute with a profound and unique mission. A mission inspired by the work he had done to fight polio.
Dr. Salk had a broad view of his place in human history and human culture. He felt that as human beings, we should be conscious of the many dimensions of our existence. So he founded an institute that would be devoted to understanding the physical, the mental, and the spiritual aspects of human beings.
To the very end, Salk approached his...
So there he is. He was still working. He never retired. He was, like I say, he was working on the AIDS vaccine when he died. So, yeah, I kind of like that about him.
His work with humility. He spent his last years struggling to uncover the secrets of another virus that causes terror, the AIDS virus.
Dr. Salk didn't reminisce too much. He was very wrapped up in what was happening now. I recall on one occasion he was asked why he thought there had been such a big impact of his discovery of a polio vaccine. And he said that he felt it was because that vaccine lifted a fear from people. So he understood that a large degree of the impact of the vaccine was to remove fear from people of the disease of polio.
Jonas Salk communicated his vision through his work, through his words, and by the gift of freedom from the fear of polio. Albert Sabin had worked for over 4 decades to beat polio and could also claim credit for victory over the disease. He and Salk, scientific adversaries, had both succeeded in their common goal to bring the polio terror to an end. Almost everyone that received the Salk vaccine would ultimately receive the Sabin vaccine as well, just to be certain they were immunized. The fear today is of killer viruses that threaten to wipe out entire populations. The pioneers who worked to unlock the secrets of one of the 20th century's most destructive viruses, polio, have helped to pave the way for future exploration. Hopefully, the painful lessons of yesterday will help answer.
Okay. Did you catch what Salk said about why his vaccine had such an impact? Anybody remember what his comments were there? Right at the very end? Why his vaccine had such an impact? Because it did what?